Are we wearing the same color?
Yeah, we definitely are. Olive.
Yeah, we have the same color on.
Yes, I just saw it on like a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
Had you
It's
guys met
nice
each
out
other
there.
before?
I'm jealous of your LA living.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you guys know each other before?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a small world. We like met through radio stuff. But also my fiance is like good friends with Rand and her husband. They knew each other from DC. So it's just like I feel like our paths have crossed anyway.
Yeah. I feel like the Arab American universe is very small.
Yeah, it's
That's,
incredibly
You know what I mean?
small.
Yeah.
true. I heard
Like, yeah.
I was listening to one of your episodes, Reema, and I heard Maith and
Oh
Hassan on
yeah.
there, and then you'll hear, yeah, just random people. I'm like, oh my God,
I
our world
know.
is so
I
small.
know.
Okay, it's 3 o'clock, so I'm gonna be mindful and just get us going. But first of all, I just want to say thanks for coming on and for doing yet another Zoom call. I know I know none of us need extra Zoom calls in our life, but I appreciate it. And it's nice to be speaking with other, in this case, Arab American women that do radio and do podcasting. We're definitely not we're definitely a minority in this world. And so I have so many questions for you guys about how you started your shows, what that process was like, and also like how you go about pitching the stories, choosing them, but also just, being who you are, especially during these times in the past few years. So I have a ton of questions. I don't know if anyone can ask questions of the people that are joining, but yeah, there's a chat. Feel free if anyone has any questions while we go through. But I guess I wanted to take some time I assume that everyone that's on the call knows that Reema Khrais is the host of This Is Uncomfortable. It's a podcast about money and how it infiltrates all areas of our lives, whether it's dating or whether it's fixing your tooth, and how that impacts it. Like, it's a great show that I've listened to from the beginning. Rand as well. I think Throughline started in 2019, early 2019. Early 2019. I've also listened to, you guys started off with a bang. I'll talk about listening to your first episode and being like, I love this part. Throughline is generally every episode. Sometimes they're varied, but generally the concept is taking historical events and talking about how they are so relevant for today's world and understanding today's world, whether it's politics, society, culture, that kind of thing. Did I do good in the
great.
intros?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my first question, and it's one that I think about a lot, is something so basic as your names. I know maybe you've talked about it before, but how you pronounce very Arab names. Both of you have sounds that are not universal. There's Reema Khrais, which is the kha, and Rand, you're like a double whammy with the the ha, and Abdelfatah. And so I wonder, and I'm sure it came up, but I wonder how you guys, what the conversation was like in terms of how you pronounce your own names to a largely US audience.
I think we actually, I think we might have actually talked about this together.
We did.
Back when we were both, I think because we were coming out with the shows around the same time. And this was a big topic of conversation.
Yeah. I think I called.
Conflicted.
Yeah, I called you and I was, because at that point, so before the podcast, a reporter on Marketplace and with the public radio station in North Carolina, and it was at NPR for a bit. Reema, it sounds weird to even say it right, Reema Khrais. And it just like never really questioned it. That's how I went, in life. Like that's how people referred to me. That's how I introduced myself. I grew up in like a small white town in North Carolina, and it was just easy. And and so not to interrupt you, but we both started our podcast relatively at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And
a few months.
Yeah. And for me, it was like, oh, this is a time to like shift potentially if I wanted to. Like, I'm reintroducing myself. And at that point, I don't know about you, Rand, but like I had started introducing myself more as Reema Khrais, just like in my day-to-day life. Especially, I mean, mostly around like Arab speakers, but generally, like I found myself saying, oh, I'm Reema. And I was like, wait, there was like this like cognitive dissonance where I was like, why am I introducing myself to the world like this? But then on this other thing that I'm going to create that's very intimate, I'm like, you know, I'm more inclined to say Reema Khrais. But yeah, so I like sort of wrestled with it in my mind. And like, now that I think about it, I'm like, why was I so conflicted? It seems like an obvious answer to me now. And not to like completely take over, Fernand, if you have any, like, why were you conflicted? Because I'm sure it's for the same reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, there's so many syllables. And that was one thing. And then the other thing, I mean, I had this conversation with my co-host Ramteen a lot, and we practiced saying, I tried to say my name more anglicized, and I couldn't say my own name. That's what I realized. I was like, it was embarrassing. I would like stumble over my own name when I tried to anglicize it. And I remember my co-host Ramteen, he was like, just say it the way you are comfortable saying it, you know? And I think I was worried that people wouldn't hear it right, and they don't. Half the people on the, like write into the show and are like, I don't know what you're saying, but I like how it sounds.
Yeah, 100%.
I'll never be able to repeat it, but I like how it sounds. So I think I think there's this sort of like, I don't know, for me, and I think it was like, this was part of the conversation we were having, Reema, was like, there's like a certain imposter syndrome already that was there, and then on top of that, to like, I don't know, exoticize yourself even more felt like it's like a double whammy. So I think that was a little bit of also.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I actually didn't connect it in that way, but for sure I felt imposter syndrome. Still do sometimes where I'm like, what am I doing? Yeah. But you're right. It's like we're signaling ourselves even more. But to me, like to your point, it felt like what saying my name the right way was truest to how I felt. And also, and like, you know, we even talked about this too. Like once we started saying our names the right way, it was like we would get like a lot of messages from people, like a lot of Arab, who are like, it's not like it would just be a very simple message. Just be like, it means a lot to me that you said your name the right way. Like I just feel seen a little bit more, and or like it, And I know that you said you got similar messages, and to me that was like the most important thing too, because you know, entering journalism, I was really conflicted. So much of it came down to just not seeing people like me who were doing it, right? I mean, it's so funny. I like looking back on how I even got into journalism, it was really just because of one person, this woman named Yasmin Ahmad, who's also in radio actually. And I went to a school in North Carolina. I went to UNC. And, you know, like a lot of people, I was really lost that first and second year, had no idea what I wanted to do, tried medical school, tried business school. I figured I'd be a lawyer. And I remember I'd see Yasmin, she was in the MSA, Muslim Student Association. And I just like see her lugging equipment around all the time. And I remember asking her, I was like, what are you doing? And she's like, oh, I'm a radio and TV major. And I just thought that was so bizarre. I was like, why are you doing that? And I was like, you know, I would love to do this in an ideal world. And she's like, oh, well, if you want to, like, you can shadow me. I'm doing an interview, radio interview next week for, you know, the local radio station. And I just shadowed her for the day and I loved it. And I remember even when I signed up for the journalism school, I like messaged her and I was like, which track did you do again? And she was like, radio and TV. I was like, okay, I'll do that too. But it was it just took one person for me to think that it was even possible. And the second I did it, I absolutely loved it. And so for me, like something as simple as saying your name, like I thought, you know, if it really does just like reach one person, if one person listens to this and it's like, oh, I see myself in this, like this is even a career that I can pursue. That means a lot to me. And I think that's important.
Was it ever like a conversation? I remember I did one story for This American Life once, and there was a lot of Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, like in those, in the saying, and like the town was Kafranbil, so it was very like heavy words. And I remember that they were asking me at some point to like soften it out and to not say things with like basically not to pronounce it the way we would. And I called Leila Fadel, who is on NPR. She went to my school in Beirut. And I remember calling her like, what do I do? Should I say Al Qaeda? Should I say like, to not, Jabhat al-Nusra? Like, should I do that? And she had some good advice where she's like, listen, on one hand, you want an American audience to understand what you're saying. On the other hand, like, think about it like this: if it were a Spanish word, would they say it like, wouldn't they like try and meet you halfway in terms of pronunciation? And so we landed, she's like, you don't have to say qaf, but say al-Qaeda instead of al-Qaeda, And in that way, I wonder if you guys ever had someone on your team or like execs be like, hey, can you soften it out a little bit? Because Rand also, like, I've heard you on the show say, even within the episode, like there was one episode about like Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and you say Ikhwan. You don't say like brotherhood, or you don't like say, you very much say the kha when you're pronunciating these things. And so I like, did you ever get pushback for this type of stuff?
I would say like, it's kind of part of the like ethos of our show a little bit to be as representative of the people that we're talking about, whether it's like Arab or whether it's, Muslim Arab or just a different culture to ours. We did an episode about a volcano in Iceland, and I spent like 45 minutes on the phone with an Icelandic man trying to pronounce the name of the volcano correctly or as close to correctly as possible. And that was, I think it's something that's like often overlooked, that the default way of pronouncing things is sort of, I don't know, there is a default way of pronouncing things, and it doesn't always factor in the culture, the people from that culture themselves. So it is something that we keep an eye on, regardless of what language we're talking about. So of course, then when it comes to like the language that's like, the one that I grew up speaking in my house, I think Ramteen also, we challenge ourselves to try and embody it as much as possible. And then of course our team can check us. Like if they just don't understand what the heck we're saying, like they can say, I actually don't know what that word is that you're saying. So can you like slow it down, or can you, so, it's good checks and balances. It's kind of like what Nada did for you. I think we do that on our team, but we tend to actually like gravitate towards let's pronounce this as accurately as possible. There's a real encouragement of that on our team. I think it's a way of showing respect for the language and also for the culture. And, I mean, of course, we're never get it 100% right. And you might even hear sometimes within an episode, more of an Islam and Islam, right? Like an alternating between pronunciations, but, we're humans, so it's not going to be entirely consistent.
Yeah, that's fair. I want to like start from the beginning a little bit and ask you guys how you came. I think both of you kind of were active in pitching the podcast that you ended up hosting. And I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about like how you developed the idea, but also how you gained the confidence to actually pitch it and believe in it. And like at what points in this process of it mulling in your head did you say, okay, I have an idea and I'm gonna share it and gonna push for it?
I think Rand has a way more interesting origin story than mine.
That's not true.
But
I like your origin story.
No,
it was a competition. It's like intense.
Yeah.
There's drama there.
Well, yeah, mine was, I mean, I really love Rand's story, but yeah, so mine was, I'll do mine quickly, but mine was an internal pitch competition within Marketplace. And, at that point I had been reporting for like 6 years maybe. And I really wanted to just like own something, to like really sit with the work that I was doing. I think when you're a reporter, you're just wedded to the news cycle and it can be very exhausting. And I wanted to be able to do stories that just like felt more impactful and where you can really understand the human experience of whatever we're talking about. And so Marketplace is an economics show. And I was really, like I said, I was really interested in more so like the human experience, how money actually, there's so much talk money in terms of, how to save or how to, how to save, how to build for retirement. It's just a lot of personal finance talk. And so I wanted to do a podcast where we really get into how this thing that defines so much of our world, I mean, all of our world, and defines our day-to-day experiences, how it shapes who we are, how it shapes our relationships, how it shapes the decisions we make, the careers we go after. And and so I definitely was nervous. I mean, like I said earlier, I definitely felt like sort of an imposter. I was like, who am I to create this thing? Who's going to listen? Like even when so long story short, I pitched the podcast and then it got greenlit. And I worked with the team for like 6 months to pilot it, which I didn't know anything about podcasting before that. I didn't realize so much time and effort goes into just like trying to figure out the thing and how it should sound, or how you'd like it to sound. And I mean, I like wrestled with a lot of like internal feelings. I was like, I remember even when we pitched it, I was like, oh, it's just gonna be a matter of time before it gets canceled. And like, it's hard to like, it was hard for me to like fully embrace it. And now like, 4 seasons in, I feel way more confident than I did when we first started. But not to ramble too much. That's how it became a thing. And it's evolved over time. Like from the time that I pitched it to the first episode, it sounds completely different. I think the first working title was Adulting, and which is a terrible name. And now This Is Uncomfortable. I can talk more about it later, but I want to, you can share your origin story because it's really great.
We also had a name that didn't make it across the finish line.
Yeah.
So you remember Primer?
Primer. Yeah, naming things is so hard.
It's so hard.
Throughline is much better than Primer.
Throughline is much better. But when you like conceive of something in your head and then you think it's like, well, I've never had a baby, but I mean, I imagine like if you imagine in your head that a child's name is something.
Yeah, you just can't separate it from
this is very telling about how I think about this show. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of was like a baby, a child, because when we started out, Ramtin and I, we met each other, I think in like what year? 2015. Oh yeah, it was a while ago. I think 2015 or 2016, and we hit it off. He's Iranian American and I'm Palestinian American, and we had a lot in common, and I think we had a lot of natural overlapping interest in politics and history and religion, as I think many Middle Easterners do, just growing up in households where that was talked about all the time. And one of the things that we very early on kind of just both expressed frustration about was that like there is not enough good coverage of the Middle East, nuanced coverage, particularly around the issue of Sunnis and Shias. He grew up in a Shia household, I grew up in a Sunni household, and we were like, this is so oversimplified. There isn't enough kind of context given. This is not like a millennia old conflict, which is kind of what the narrative was. And so there were frustrations like that stemmed from a very personal kind of relationship to the news we were seeing. And we were both producers at the time, never been on air. Like we just had this idea. So, and for some reason, that we should pitch it. There was no good reason to think that we should like go to.
Which is unheard of, by the way. Like NPR doesn't just greenlight like a podcast that like producers pitch. It was.
Yeah, like, and for the record, they did not just greenlight this either because they were
what was it though? Yeah,
it was a process.
Yeah, it was a
process.
What was the process
like?
I mean, the long story short is that we like took the idea, and initially they were kind of like, cool, but like, what are we? We're just producers, not just producers. I hate saying just producers. Producers are amazing. They're like the backbone of every single show. They're like unspoken heroes. Anyway, but like we had never been on air, right? So when we went to them with my boss at the time with this idea, he was kind of like, this is a good idea, but didn't know what to do with it. And then they did like some audience testing 6 months later and saw that like history was the number one thing that audiences wanted. And they're like, oh, you had this idea 6 months ago. Do you want to do something with it? So that started a 2-year process of basically piloting this show. On the side, we had full-time jobs working on podcasts like How I Built This in TED Radio Hour. And this we were doing on the nights and weekends. Like we were not actually given time to just work on it until about 2 or 3 months before the show launched. So it was a long process. There was a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know if it was going to happen for sure. I mean, Reema knows it was like very stressful for a lot of the process.
Yeah.
And I think part of the like barrier that we had to cross was that, one, we were not typical hosts, both our backgrounds, but also like our ethnic backgrounds, but also I think our professional backgrounds. We are producers, and you know, had never been on air. So there was a lot of like, initially I remember Ramti and I were talking about like, who's going to do the interviews? And we were like, well, I guess we'll do them. And so we just started doing every step of the process, and Ramtin composes music. So we were literally able to do every single part of it, from doing the interviews to scripting to producing to sound designing and then to scoring. And so it was very much like a self-contained operation. And then we had like one of our like friends and co-producers on one of the shows we were working on, Lawrence Wu, he was just like sitting near us and was like, hey, what are you guys working on? And we were like, oh, you know, we're working on this thing. It's, you know, it was called Primer at the time. We're thinking of calling it Primer. And he's like, can I just help out? And again, he just helped out. like just, again, no designated job, nothing. And, you know, I think there was a lot of passion behind it. And that's what kind of kept us going, because there were a lot of moments where we weren't sure if it was going to happen. And I think we just really felt very, very motivated to do it, because we felt like this was missing. Like, these kinds of stories, these perspectives in history are missing. And I don't know if folks have heard our show, but like, we really wanted to create something that felt like you were watching a movie, like your ears were watching a movie. And so that was a big goal of ours. And eventually we got to, you know, we launched, and we've been going for 2 years now, but it does feel surreal some days still, because it was a long process. And I think that process in some ways was helped us to develop our voice as hosts, and also like figure out exactly, because Reema, you said this, right? Like, figuring out what is the soul of the show.
It takes a long time to figure that out.
It does.
And have you figured it out? I mean, I imagine it's evolving, but like, when you think about the soul of this show, is it your personal passion? Is it like something that you're constantly trying to attain? Like, when you go into every episode, what is the through line, if I can be,
the through line of the through line.
The through line of the through line. You know, like, what is the mindset in which you're going into every show when it comes to picking the show, but also picking your guests? Like, what is the soul? What is the crux?
I like to think that it's constantly evolving. This was something that when we set out, like Ramti and I said, if a year from now the show sounds the exact same, something's gone wrong. Like, we wanted it to keep evolving. But I think the really core kind of like principles at the heart of the show are, one, that we're telling stories that are not told, or that are told in a certain way, and we sort of challenge ourselves and our listeners to think of them in a different way. I think that is a really big driving principle, like in terms of the stories we're telling, who we bring on to tell the stories, how we're telling the stories. It's all about challenging the narratives that we think we know. We, as in the people on the show, but also like we as a society and as a culture think we know, because I think history is one of those things that, like, the more you just keep repeating the stories, the more like entrenched they become, even if they're not entirely true. And you know, as you start to kind of like pull back the layers, you realize that like there are so many aspects of the stories that we think we know. Like, for example, when we started looking at the history of like recycling in this country, we were like, you know, it seems blasphemous to say that recycling is not a good thing, right? And we're not, and our argument is not that recycling isn't a good thing, but we realized in doing the episode that like, if you just take that at face value that like you should recycle, it's on you, the consumer, to recycle, you actually end up missing the bigger picture, which is that there was a very concerted effort after World War II, as manufacturing boomed and, you know, the plastic industry was like creating all of this new waste, to actually put the responsibility for recycling on you, the consumer. And if you miss that, you're actually missing the bigger story, right? And so that's what we're trying to always do, is look for what are the things that help fill in the gaps of what's really going on.
Yeah, if I can talk about one thing that I found surprising too, in your opioid, I remember you had an episode about the opioid epidemic, but kind of looking at the history of opiates in America. And one of the things that I found so surprising is that, you know, women were the #1 consumers of opiates when it first started. And I found that fascinating, like when it came to like how to deal with period pain or something like that. Like actually it's women. Now we don't think of that, because I think opiates #1 consumers are like men currently. But when you look at the history, I found that, so that was like a moment that I thought was like typical of Throughline, where you think you know, but you don't, you know.
Yeah.
And Reema, what about you when you think about like, you know, how much of also your own personal life do you bring into, like, are you thinking what would be interesting to me, or is it a thought like, what, you know, what do I think maybe my listeners want to hear?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, like to Ran's point, I think This Is Uncomfortable has evolved, and it's continuing to evolve, in the sense that when I first pitched it, you know, I was so focused on like, so before, just for some context, before the podcast, I was, like I said, I was reporting. And so I was like, you know, turning around like 4-minute, 3-minute news stories. And when I made the switch to narrative storytelling, which is a whole different beast, and I don't think I fully understood that. You know, in my mind, I was like, oh, you just tell these like cool, intimate stories. And I was so fixated on like just trying to find surprising, quirky stories, things that would like, you know, make someone want to talk about it over dinner the next day. And because I was, you know, learning about narrative, and when you learn about narrative, you're told, you know, you need to find an interesting character, and you need to have that character go through a journey, and you need there to be some kind of like resolution. And so yeah, I was so focused on like just trying to create something that people would want to listen to, that I think I lost sight initially at the beginning of how like so many of the most important stories are just fun. It's sort of what I'm saying, it's like fundamentally about power. And I think increasingly I'm like, before we approach a story, I'm like, I try to ask myself like, okay, what are the power dynamics here at play? Like, yes, maybe we're focused on this one narrative, but like, what does this one person's story say about the larger systems and structures? And it's, you know, I think it's actually really easy to lose sight of that sometimes, because, you know, like even some of the best storytellers I know, like I'll listen to something like, they just missed the mark here. Like that wasn't, you know, they're so focused on maybe fact checking and making sure everything's right and making sure that there's this, you know, surprising elements to it, without actually questioning the framing or the analysis of it. And yeah, and so that's something that I try to keep in mind, even if it's like, you know, that doesn't mean to stray away from narrative storytelling. It just means like, how can we find ways to just essentially contextualize it? Like we did a story, I think last November, where it was about how moms are struggling during the pandemic, right? Which is like, we saw a lot of reports about that. We did an intimate take on one woman's experience, and we really delved into her world. And then maybe at the beginning of the podcast, we would have just aired that story and called it a day. But then with this episode, we decided for the second half to really take just a closer look at, you know, why is this the case, right? Like, oh, it's because of sexism. It's because of lack of affordable childcare. It's because of little to no paid maternity leave. It's because of the gender pay gap. And so I think, you know, with stories about money, especially, it's important that we always frame things with the larger picture in mind. And so, yeah, so hopefully that answered part of your question.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, like, well, one question that I'm curious about, and then we can move on to how, you know, the intonations of how we narrate and do our VO and that kind of thing. But for both of you, like, was there ever a question from inside your workplaces where they're like, you know what, Randan, Ramteen, or Reema Khrais, like your identity itself can stray away a largely US audience, or maybe like people, was there ever a concern that maybe because your names sound different, or that you're not a white male, which is usually who you hear on the radio, that alone would be a reason that your podcast might not do as well?
No, I never got those. Oh, sorry, not to cut you off, Ron. Go for it.
No, you go.
I was gonna say, I haven't gotten those messages before. I think quite the opposite. Like I feel like very supported in my workplace, which is nice. I did have like one anecdote or one encounter with someone who will go unnamed where I remember I asked him, he works with me. I asked him, I was like, oh, this was when I was like, I should say my name, you know, and I was like, oh, what do you think? And this was a white man, and he was like, who has power? And he was like, well, no, like I wouldn't go on air and say Paris, I would say Paris. And I was like, oh. And I remember that being kind of like a defeating, like that made me really question whether I should do it. Like, and yeah. And I think I was afraid that, I mean, to go back to the name thing, I was afraid that if I say my name the right way, then certain hosts would shy away from wanting to say it correctly, or maybe they wouldn't want to give me as much airtime. And maybe that's like I'm projecting. No one actually said that, but I think that was a fear that I had. But yeah, beyond that one encounter, I don't feel like I ever dealt with any pushback. How about you, Ron?
Yeah, I agree. Like I think overall the organization has been super like hands off about the kinds of stories we do. And I think in some ways it's like, it surprised me and Ramteen, like, especially initially, because we were doing some pretty provocative stories, international stories, domestic stories that really are challenging, I think, our listeners. And I think partly it's the luck of timing, right? We sort of were coming up at a time when podcasting itself was expanding. Who is a podcaster was expanding. What is a podcast was expanding. Like all these things were being challenged. Like the typical sort of old school style was being challenged. And I think we were partly right place, right time. There was an appetite for the kinds of things that we wanted to do with the show. And I think we really built it into the mission of the show that like we were going to do international stories. And we were going to do domestic stories, of course, but we were going to do things that were going to challenge the narratives. It's really a part of the mission. So there was no secret there. And we have been really like, you know, I mean, really surprised and grateful actually about like across the organization, we've reached out to reporters who are kind of specialized in certain areas, editors, things like that. And they're always very down to help and to like listen to episodes, to read through scripts, things like that. And, you know, most often the reaction is like, I'm so glad that like you guys are going to be spending so much time on this, right? Because, you know, so often I think reporters and stuff, they have like 5 minutes max to you know, share something or to talk about something. And so I think it's been really refreshing actually to see that reaction. And I feel like I think it's a testament to what happens when you don't underestimate the audience. I think there's a lot of like, you know, tiptoeing or kind of like taking for granted what you think the audience wants. And I feel like sometimes it's really worth it to just make the show that you want to make and have trust that like maybe not everyone will like it, but you know, there will be plenty of people who do like it. And we've been really surprised and like it's been nice to see the response that we've gotten from people of different political backgrounds, you know, people who are conservative and liberal, you know, writing in, people of different, you know, religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, age groups. And the fact that, you know, the fact that basically people with different perspectives can listen and walk away feeling like okay, this was like a well-rounded history. Like I might not agree with every point, but like but I can respect the sort of perspective that's being offered here. Makes us feel good, you know, like one of
especially with a
the
topic like history.
exactly, because like we did an episode on the history of evangelicalism in America, which is like, again, like we're both Muslim hosts, right? And so when you approach something like that, I feel like you need to take a special, extra care, basically, to sort of do your due diligence to make sure that you're kind of like understanding the nuance and the angles. And so, you know, that episode was one of it was really satisfying seeing their responses to that episode, because we had people who were evangelical themselves who wrote in and were like, thank you for this episode. Like, you're talking about things that, like, you know, I've seen within my community. And then there were people who were outside of the community talking about, thank you for shedding light on something that was so like opaque to me before. And again, if the fact that both people can sort of write in and feel like it was meaningful to them, it's what we aim to do.
Yeah. I feel like, I think about audience a lot too. And it, like, to answer your question from earlier, then, if how many of the stories are reflective of my own experiences. And I think the second or third episode that we ever did, it was, so just a little context. When we first launched this podcast, we had a lot of conversation about who our audience is, right? Like, who do we want it to be? And we like even created like, and maybe you even did this on like target, like we created like full profile of people. Yeah. Like we'd be like, this person listens to podcasts and then goes to CrossFit and then does this, or
oh really
this book. Like we like really tailored it just so that we can like visually see the person. And for me, it was also important to have to diversify the audience. Marketplace's audience, public radio's audience is notoriously overwhelmingly white. And the last I saw, I'm pretty sure our podcast has like the most diverse numbers in terms of age and backgrounds. And I think that's partly because of the stories that we choose. And I think, like, so going back to what I was saying earlier, the second or third episode we did was it was about the roles that we take on in our family. So even though the podcast is about money, it's also, sometimes we're a little meta about it, and it's also about our relationship to work, and even how that shows up in the household. And so we did an episode about how, in every family and every environment they grow up, sometimes people take on these roles, whether you're the emotional caretaker or you're the comedian or you're this or that. And I did a story and so I thought about it, and I was like, well, what was my role growing up? And I realized that my role was really like being the translator for my family. And how, being the child of immigrants, Palestinian immigrants, oftentimes my dad would come and ask me to talk to the representative over the phone, or to leave the voicemail message, or to draft an email. And so I talked about this role that I had taken on as a kid, but hadn't really made sense of myself, and chatted about it pretty intimately with my dad, because we hadn't really talked about it. And I thought about it because even when I went home a few years ago, when I first produced this piece, he asked me to send it like a really simple email. He was like, I just want to respond about this like work party, and I don't want it to sound bad. And I was like, Baba, you need to trust yourself. You're fine. You know how to do this. But anyway, it was really endearing. And that's how this piece came about, and partly how it came about. And anyway, I say all of that because once we aired that, I just wasn't expecting, I wasn't expecting anything. And we got so many emails in response being like, oh, I had a similar experience, and I've never heard anyone really identify it like that, and or really just talk about it. And I think, that's the value in having diverse voices and, typically mainstream outlets, to see their experiences reflected is really important.
Yeah, totally. Also, in your guests, I think on both of your shows, your guests tend to be very diverse as well. And sometimes I feel like it's maybe it's not on your part, but just deliberate in who you have speaking on certain topics, which I always appreciate so much. Like in an episode, it's just like the speakers I always feel are are very deliberate and also very diverse. Like, Reema, you have friends on, and your friends come from like different backgrounds, and so I appreciate that as well. So it's people not just seeing themselves in you, but also in your guests. You know,
very true.
I want to touch base a little bit about a topic that annoys me so much, but that I think about a lot, which is how we talk on podcasts today. And you know, that's very, you know, Michael Barbaro way of talking on podcasts that's just driving me
seeing it on King's Comic Pets Popcorn.
Yeah. Oh yeah, do you see Ramtin in the chat? Yeah, he's trolling. He's my co-host.
And I find that so many hosts of other shows just mimic that way of talking with the long pauses. And I like, even when they are not like I find that there's somehow a formula that is now being popularized of how you actually speak on podcasts that's really just driving me mad. And I know that it's not intentional, and we're all guilty of just repeating what we've heard for so many years, and all of us probably listened to podcasts before. But I wonder if there was any effort on your part to be like, this is how I'm going to talk. I'm going to speak like this on my podcast, and that's just the way it is. Or did you ever do coaching, or like, how did you find what sounded normal and natural?
Yeah, I also have a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
I'm laughing because this was a very intentional thing that we did talk about when we were sort of finding our voice. And you know, we really didn't want to sound like that. I think we were like, look, this is how we talk. We've got our like like New York regional like accents. I say water without pronouncing the T, which really annoys people, by the way.
Dude, okay, can I say really the first hate mail that I ever got was someone was like, you said, what did I say? I said written instead of written. And she was like,
who says that? I want to know who pronounces the T like that. You know, we did an episode about Putin, and I can't tell you how many people wrote, not that many people, it was probably like 3, but it felt like a lot of people who were like, I guess I was supposed to say Putin. And I'm like, we're not talking about poutine here, okay, which is the Canadian fries. We're talking about, like, you know, I'm just like, cool. I've never heard anyone say Putin. Maybe I have, but I you know, it just doesn't roll off
the things that like irritate people are wild.
Yeah, it is.
But screw them. Anyway, keep going. Yeah. So you all were really intentional about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, we were intentional about it, and we were kind of like, I have to say that overwhelmingly the response to our voices has been positive. That like people are like, I like that you all sound like, one, you're discovering, like you're figuring this stuff out. You're not just like the authorities, because we're not historians, you know, we're journalists that are like uncovering history with people who know a lot more than us about things. And then the other thing was, like, the same conversation, the same thought process around like not softening the era part of myself when I speak. I mean, you know, I grew up in New Jersey. I'm gonna say certain things that like have New Jersey flair, right? So I feel like that was something that we really began to own once the show launched, because we realized, you know, at first I think we were like, we're gonna do it, but there was a little bit of like timidness. And then when we realized like people appreciated that people are exhausted with the sort of Michael Barbaro, Ira Glass thing. There's a lot of like, in my opinion, not to be harsh, but like Ira Glass wannabes a little bit, right? Of like, this is the thing that seemed to work, right?
Yeah.
Am I going too hard? All right, I'm passing it over to you.
No. I disagree. Agree. I mean, it's hard, right? Like it's something that every time, it's funny, I even, despite doing this for like, I act like I'm like so old, the last 10 years, like every time I go and record something, I still feel a little uncomfortable because, like I almost have to like remind myself to sound like myself, despite how long I've been doing this. And it's like truly hard sometimes to sound like yourself because you've internalized so many voices and what's credible. The first time, if I went back a while back and listened to my first piece that I did for NPR, and I sound like a robot. Like I just tried to emulate whatever I thought was credible, and that was a white man, right? And I thought that was the only way that anyone was going to take what I'm saying seriously. Otherwise, they're going to think I'm juvenile. They're going to think that I don't actually know what I'm talking about. And so I just tried to sound like, insert any NPR white man's name. And I remember one of my friends listened, she like caught one of my pieces on the radio, and she was like, I heard you and it didn't sound anything like you. And she said it almost like as a compliment. And I remember at the time being like, oh, like, yeah, that's great. And now in retrospect, that's awful. Like, I don't want to make something that doesn't sound like me. Like especially with the podcast, right? Like I stumble over my words. I'm imperfect in how I talk. And it's hard sometimes trying to like bring that forward, like the authenticity when it's such a produced, product at the end of the day. And so that's something I like, even just earlier today, I was writing a script, and it's like sometimes you almost have to actively, I'm getting more into the writing, which affects how you talk. But I was writing a script, and I almost have to actively remind myself to take a step back and question, is this something I would actually say? I think we're writing an episode right now about MLMs, which are, do you know what that are? They're like these scammy companies essentially. And I had a line in there that was like, a lot of experts compare MLMs to cults, or something like that. And then I went and got some water, and I came back to my computer, and I looked at that line, and I was like, that's not how I really talk. And I changed it, and I was like, if you're listening to this and you've thought at some point, this kind of sounds like a cult, or you're probably right. Or it was something that was way more conversational and casual.
Right.
And it was something to that effect. And so I think so much of how you actually sound on a podcast comes down to the writing, obviously. And like I said, sometimes I have to really like look at what I'm writing with a critical eye and ask myself, would I say this to my sister? Or would I say this to my mom? Because I do think that the more real you are, and again, like I said, this is something I struggle with. Like sometimes I feel, I listen back, I'm like, I missed the mark a little with that. Like I could have been a little bit more casual, or I could have,
for sure.
And I lost my train of thought. I was going to say, sometimes I mess up, but wow, I completely lost my train of thought. What was I just saying?
Come down to the writing. Do you both actively write
down to the writing?
What you're gonna read or say? Like, do you both write out? Like, are you a part of the script writing as well? And do you think that helps then, with the way you sound on the radio?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's like, I mean, Ramtin and I are still doing production, so we definitely are part of some of the script writing, but we also have like team of producers that I think have just gotten to know our voice as well. So we'll, they draft the script, and we can kind of like tweak it to fit our voices. If we're like, we would never say this word, like you were saying, Reema, like I can never see myself saying, if I can't, if I have to like stop and think, how do I even pronounce it? Then get rid of it. That word is not something you would ever say. But I do think that, and this is where being a producer, I think, helped transitioning into being a host, at least for us, because I think so much of the style of our show, which is kind of it's a documentary style show, right? It is very produced, like to Reema's point, right? And so when it's so produced, it's like a little bit different than some other shows that have like banter and sort of more of that casual approach. And so but we're still thinking about that same thing. Like, how do you make it feel like it's something that, you know, like our parents could understand, like that it's something that is, you know, easily, I mean, these are complicated topics, but we're trying to make them easily understandable. And I think one thing that really helps me with the scripting is just to really, to like incorporate the tape as I'm writing, because you're much more likely to really have the writing inform the tape that you're choosing, and the tape inform how you're writing. And so it's something I always like suggest to people, is to really sit with the tape first, cut it up in ways that are understandable to you so that it's easy to kind of plug in, and then just really try to have it be as organic as possible, flowing back and forth, because I think it just makes it feel like much more cohesive. If you're kind of retroactively plugging things in, it can work, but I think it might interrupt the flow a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's just, you know, but everyone has their style. That's the thing.
Yeah, I know. I remember what I was gonna say earlier too. I agree with the tape thing for sure. And I was gonna say, yeah, sometimes you miss the mark, but I do think the more you lean into trying to sound how you actually sound and being yourself, I think it resonates more with people. And I'm like, that took me a long time to realize, because again, I came from this radio background thinking like, I can't insert my personality, like that's not what you do in news, or I can't be funny, or I can't do this and that. And yeah, there's a time and place, like not every moment in a piece calls for humor or for personality. And but I do think, especially when you're working on a piece, like on our podcast, we do, you know, we do a lot of narrative, and sometimes I'm the character. And in that case, I think people, like the more real you are, the more vulnerable you are, the more it resonates with people. Yeah. And also, like, you know, when I first started this podcast, I would go back and forth. I was like, well, should I sound like a reporter? Should I sound like myself? Like, and honestly, sometimes I just do a mix of both. Like sometimes I'm in reporter mode, and that's fine. Like that's who I am too. Sometimes I can be like more you know, sort of matter of fact, or especially when you're just conveying like stats or facts or whatever. And then other times I can show more of my personality, and that's cool. I think
sometimes the question that crosses through my mind is like, can the audience handle the level of cheese I'm about to put out? Because there's a lot. I have most of my jokes are in the very cheesy department, so you know,
like dad jokes
in small doses, it's okay, but not in big doses.
Dude, it's so hard to insert humor though.
It's really hard.
It's hard because really you're right. There is a fine line between cheesy and like actually funny.
Yeah, that's why it's good to have an editor and to have a team that can be like, no, we'll save that for ourselves. Like the world doesn't need to hear that. You know, it's good.
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes on other shows where you do find that they're just mimicking someone else, all I can think of while I'm listening is like, oh, this tone, the way they're speaking reminds me of X, Y, and Z, rather than actually focusing on what they're saying. I wonder, when you in your process of kind of finding or just, you know, just being yourself. I know we all sound very different than we did like years ago, but I wonder, like, you know, when it came to feedback, was there certain feedback that you got that really changed how you spoke or how you decided on stories? Like, what are some, you know, memorable things that you try and keep in mind? Like, Reema, you mentioned your friend once told you like, oh, great, you don't sound like yourself. Is there other kind of feedback that you've gotten about your show and your own voice or your identity on the show that, you know, runs through the back of your head sometimes when you're writing or producing or interviewing?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like early on, Reema, you mentioned listening back to old pieces you recorded, like listening back to old interviews.
Oh my God.
When I was starting out, I mean, so rough. And so I think one of the things that, I mean, multiple people sort of helped guide me through it, you know, but I think was like owning that space really like step into, even if, I mean, I'm more introverted by nature. And I think when I started out, there was sort of this real, like, you can hear it in my voice, like even in the interviews, it was just like this real, like, lack of confidence. There was, you know, and someone, I forgot who told me this, and I feel so bad that I'm forgetting who told me this, but they said, when you go into the interview, whatever energy you have, increase it by like 50%. Like whatever feels comfortable, increase it by 50%. And then that's probably going to be like around what you need. And I still think about that. I still get myself in a headspace where I'm like, okay, like get ready to go in. Like, you know, it's tapping into a side of yourself. It's not like, it's not me. It's just a side of myself that like I have to work a little harder at. And so, and I did an aspect of it to come and talk to y'all today on this Zoom, to be honest. Right. So I think it's just like, that was super helpful to me, because I realized like, you don't have to be one, you know, one thing to be like, to fit the mold of what a host is. Just like we were talking about the voice, same with like personality, same with the way you think about things, right? Like, I don't know. I think that was a real growth moment, and it took time. It took time to actually start to embody that. And like you were saying, Reema, about imposter syndrome, it's ebbs and flows. It's not like
totally
you never feel those feelings ever, but that really helped me.
No, I know exactly what you mean. That's how I felt when I started doing interviews, because before this podcast, all the interviews I did were like, you know, they were private. No one would ever listen to that tape except for me. Like I could ask stupid questions. I could, you know, sort of sit with moments that I don't actually need to sit with, but I just like want small little details or whatever. But now I'm way more exposed. Even if the whole interview doesn't air on the podcast, there's usually a producer or two listening in, and that can be kind of vulnerable. And I definitely felt like you just said, that on like with the voice, trying to emulate, you know, whatever white NPR reporter, I felt like I needed to emulate like the kinds of interviews I would hear on NPR growing up. And it took a long time, and it still takes like some effort when I enter an interview to sort of like remind myself that I can be myself and people will like it. Like you can do that. And it's funny, like sometimes I think the best interviews I do are the ones where I'm like, I don't know if it's going to air on the podcast anyway, like let's just do it and see if it'll lead to something. And it's usually because I'm way more relaxed and like the stakes are lower, like I'm inserting more of my laughter, I'm asking questions that genuinely come to mind. And so with that, there are two things that sometimes think about. And this first piece of advice is from Kai Rizdal, who's like the host of Marketplace. And I agree with this to a certain extent, but he was like, I'm going to butcher it, but basically he said, if you're like, don't think about it. Like if you have a natural reaction, just say it. The more you think about it, the more people will actually hear you thinking. And it's tough because it's like, you want to have a thoughtful response, but at the same time you want it to be authentic. And so I think about that a lot. And then I remember when I first started tracking the podcast, recording it, I would go into the studio and I would like, again, I'd have more of my reporter voice on. And I remember my senior producer, Megan, she was like, no, just like, just relax. And she was like, just remember, this is so cheesy, but she like printed off like, you know, from Mean Girls, the cool mom. She's like, I'm not a normal mom, I'm a cool mom. She like printed off a picture of that mom, and she replaced it with, I'm a cool host. And so like, it's so silly, but I think about that almost every time I'm in a booth. I'm like, I'm a cool host. I'm going to sound cool and casual. So there's that. And then I also always think of early on when I was like recording and trying to figure out the voice of the podcast, she would come in and like sit in the studio and she would like look at me intently. She'd be like this whenever I was talking. And so sometimes I like still see her face because I'm like, okay, I'm talking to someone who's genuinely interested and I'm super excited to tell them that thing. And so that's also helped.
And I would just add one thing, because Reema, when you were talking about what Kai said, it reminded me of this, which is like, you don't have to be, in fact, you shouldn't be the smartest person in the room. Like when you're doing an interview, don't feel like you need to like ask the perfect question. Like sometimes the simplest questions yield the best answers. And sometimes asking the question like 2 or 3 times gets you finally the answer you're kind of looking for. So like, and that might feel uncomfortable because you're like, this might feel uncomfortable. Sorry. But like, you know, the sort of, I don't know, aversion you might have to be like, well, we already asked that and they didn't really want to answer that, or they didn't answer it completely, it might make you sort of hesitant to kind of ask it again. But oftentimes you're actually giving the guests, my editor told me this once, you're giving the guests the opportunity to then have a second chance themselves to answer it again after they've processed a little bit more. And I think that's like something I never really thought about, because I'm like, it's not about you. Right? I'm like, I always was going into it being like, oh, it's about me as the interviewer. It's like, no, it's about the guest, getting the best out of the guest, right? And really trying to like connect with them as much as possible, making them comfortable. And so I feel like that is something that also was like a learning process for me.
Especially because with, not to keep going on the thread, but especially with narrative storytelling, sometimes, you know, I'm in an interview for 2 to 3 hours at some, you know, if it's like a really in-depth interview. And I always, like, we joke that sometimes a good interview sounds like a therapy session. Yeah. And part of the reason why you have to, like, you know, like therapy, sometimes it takes a while to like reach the conclusions and to really think about what actually is motivating you, right? Like, we don't always have this like perfect script and perfect answers to who we are. And so that's sort of part of the process, especially with narrative. And there's also like a whole conversation there with like how to do that empathetically, but you know.
Yeah.
I will say, Reema, that I really, you know, you say, I think there was a bio that you said that you're kind of goofy, but I do get that goofiness too sometimes in the podcast, which I love. Like there was one thing that made me laugh out loud. I think you were interviewing Chani Nichols, like the astrologer.
Yeah.
And then people were asking questions, and then you're just like, okay, let's just try and help someone else. And it was like, so, you know, just like off the cuff, and like, and it made me laugh because that was your personality, and it was like funny. And so I will say that, yeah, I think so much of your personality comes out on the show, and I love it because it's like funny at times, and even though you're talking about something serious, it's like effortless. And well, at least that's
what you're saying, that.
I don't want to take up more of your time. I want to kind of be mindful of everyone's time. But as a final answer, someone had asked like what podcasts you guys are listening to, and maybe we can end with that.
I'll go first.
I listen to Throughline.
I listen to This Is Uncomfortable. Y'all should check it out. No, but really check it.
I'm like looking through my podcasts. I feel like it ebbs and flows, to be honest.
Yeah.
Kerning Culture. I'm like looking through my list. Bodies is a great podcast. California City, Call Your Girlfriend.
Assess what one's job
something
is
just played.
during the handoff.
I do listen to The Daily just because it's informative. And
yeah, you know, I mean, Michael Barbaro is Michael Barbaro. We don't need 700 of him, you know.
Exactly.
Same with Ira Glass. Like, it's great. That's how he talks. Yeah.
Those are a few of them. I do listen to Sam Sanders. It's been a minute. It's like a good chatty show. Heavyweight is like a nice narrative show that I like. Death, Sex, and Money. Those are a few of them. I don't have any comedy podcasts. I don't listen to many chat podcasts. They're usually like pretty well, like more of the produced.
Same. Yeah, I second a lot of the ones you just said, Reema. Particularly It's Been a Minute, and some of the NPR sister shows I would recommend, like Code Switch, It's Been a Minute, Embedded. They have a new season that's really powerful on the Capitol Gazette shooting. And then outside NPR, I mean, I just have to say I'm a big fan of the BBC podcast, like the Witness History podcast. I really recommend that one. If you're into more kind of experimental listening, I recommend Love Me. It's a show from Canadian Public Broadcasting. It's really just beautiful, tender kind of stories. Radio Lab, which is kind of the OG in terms of the, you know, like highly produced. It was a real inspiration to us as we were starting the show.
More Perfect is really good too.
More Perfect is really good. Yeah. Let me think. Oh, I really recommend for like really, really good investigative journalism, In the Dark.
Oh yeah, In the Dark's great.
It's it is. Yeah. I highly recommend that show. I mean, that's just like a really good example of like just how to do good journalism. And then I have to shout out our intern on the show on Throughline is a part of this production team for a show called Fireline out of Montana Public Radio, and it is really good, and it's about wildfires. And as folks who live in California, which I think a lot of you on this call do, I think you'd be interested in listening to this. It's kind of a nice combination of both present and past of like wildfire history. So I recommend that one as well.
Amazing. Nice. Anything else you guys want to add before we end? Anything that I didn't ask you or you want people to know? Reema, you have a new season about.
Oh yeah, I do. Sorry, I got distracted by the comments. I do have something to say. Yeah, we have. This has been. I feel like it's already in the middle of the week. It's been a long week, so it's our launch week. So we're launching a new season this Thursday. It's our 4th season. I'm really excited about it. Subscribe if you haven't already. I think it'll be great. So yeah. And
I guess I'll plug our upcoming episodes. So you know. So we have some really I think powerful episodes coming up. Some of the highlights are an episode looking at the history of the Black Panther Party, but it's a history unlike I think you've heard before. It kind of explores the hidden socialist dimension, which was really the kind of foundation of the Black Panther Party, which has sort of been written out of the history. And it'll coincide with the Oscars because we believe Judas and the Black Messiah will be a top contender. And then we have an episode coming up that we've been thinking about for a long, long time about the Uyghurs. It's, there's a genocide happening there. And unfortunately, it's just not getting as much kind of visibility as it should be. And so we're going to be exploring the history from kind of the 1950s on. And it's really also, it's a historical look at what's happened, but also a celebration of Uyghur culture. And then we have, I think this will interest some folks in this audience, a kind of 10 years on look back at the Arab Spring. And we're going to be centering kind of first person voices of people on the ground who were in a few of the key places and experience the Arab Spring firsthand. So those are a couple of the things coming up that you all should check out.
Sounds amazing. I'm excited.
Me too.
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. I know it's a little bit late for you, Dance.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This was just also fun to see y'all. I like it.
Yeah.
Hopefully in person soon.
Yes, inshallah.
Hopefully. Can you all fly me out to LA though? Because I'd love to come out to LA. Don't come to New York. I'll come to LA.
We have 2 homes that you're more than welcome in.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
All right. We'll see you soon.
Take care.
Bye. Bye, everyone.